Yamamoto knew exactly how America would destroy Japan. He put it in writing. His own government ignored him, attacked anyway, and handed him command of the fleet that was supposed to prove him wrong. What followed was not a story of military genius versus military genius. It was a story of a man forced to execute a plan he had already calculated would fail, against an enemy who knew he was coming before he arrived. This is the story of how the most important naval battle in the Pacific was decided not by ships, not by aircraft, not by courage, but by information. And how the man who understood that better than anyone on either side was the one man who never got to use it.
We're all that's left.
In 1940, Isoroku Yamamoto sent a letter to the Japanese Navy minister. It was not a routine communication. It was a warning. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He had traveled extensively across the United States during his postings there in the 1920s. He had seen the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the oil fields of Texas, the automobile factories of Detroit. He had watched a nation going about its ordinary business, producing, building, consuming at a scale that Japan could not approach. And he had understood something that most of his colleagues in Tokyo had not bothered to calculate. America was not yet at war, but if it decided to fight, it would bring to that fight an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could sustain over time. He wrote that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. Not might not, could not. He calculated that Japan had a window, perhaps 18 months, perhaps 2 years at the outside, in which its naval superiority could inflict enough damage to force a negotiated peace before American industrial capacity reversed every advantage Japan currently held. After that window closed, the outcome was not uncertain. It was mathematical. The letter was received, noted, and ignored. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto did not celebrate when the results came in. His staff described his expression that evening as one of deep concern, not because the attack had failed, but because of what it had not destroyed. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that day. They were at sea, intact. And Yamamoto understood, with a clarity that kept him awake through the night, that the carriers were not simply ships. They were the mechanism by which the United States would eventually destroy him. He had 18 months, maybe less. The clock had started. 10 days after Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz arrived in Hawaii aboard a submarine. What he found when he came ashore was a fleet in a state of collective shock. The dead had not all been buried. The smell of burned fuel still hung over the harbor. Officers who met him on the docks had the expressions of men who had witnessed something they could not fully process. Nimitz walked the piers. He inspected the damage. He spoke with survivors. Then he said something that confused almost everyone in the room. He did not talk about revenge. He did not talk about rebuilding. He talked about intelligence. He said the only way to compensate for material inferiority, for the reality of facing Yamamoto with what remained after Pearl Harbor, was to know what Yamamoto was going to do before Yamamoto did it. No one in the room fully understood yet what that meant. But in a windowless basement 2 miles away, a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort already did. If you're finding this story worth your time, subscribe now. There's much more of this kind of history coming to this channel, stories the standard documentaries don't tell. Rochefort had been working on the Japanese Naval Code, designated JN-25B, for months. His team ran 18-hour shifts. They slept on cots between the machines. They ate at their desks. Some of them had not seen sunlight in weeks. Station Hypo, the basement intelligence unit Rochefort commanded, was not a prestigious posting. It was a concrete room full of exhausted men doing work that most of the Navy's senior leadership did not fully understand and did not particularly trust. JN-25B was the most complex cipher the Imperial Japanese Navy had designed. It contained every operational plan, every fleet movement, every strategic intention the Japanese Navy transmitted by radio. Rochefort did not have the full code. Nobody did. What his team had managed, after months of brutal analytical work, were fragments, partial intercepts, pieces of messages without context, data points that suggested patterns without confirming them. It was intelligence work in its rawest form, building certainty out of uncertainty, making decisions based on what the evidence implied rather than what it stated. But in April 1942, those fragments began to form a shape. The Japanese were planning a massive operation in the Central Pacific. The target appeared in intercepted messages as two letters, AF. The messages did not say what AF was. They did not give a precise date. They did not specify the full force composition. But Rochefort was certain AF was Midway Island. Washington did not believe him. The admirals in the capital thought the next Japanese strike would come in the South Pacific, toward Australia, toward the supply lines connecting the United States to its allies in the region. They thought AF could be Hawaii. They thought it could be the American West Coast. They told Rochefort he was making the classic analytical error, seeing what he wanted to see in incomplete data, projecting a conclusion onto evidence that didn't fully support it. The argument was not unreasonable. Rochefort was working with a code he could only partially read. The margin for catastrophic error was real. But Rochefort was not guessing. He was reasoning from everything his team had accumulated. Months of intercepts, patterns of Japanese naval communication, the logic of Japanese strategic objectives. He needed proof Washington couldn't dismiss. He designed a trap. He instructed the Midway garrison to transmit an unencrypted radio message, completely open, readable by anyone monitoring the frequency, reporting that the island's water distillation plant had suffered a serious mechanical failure and that fresh water supplies were critically low. It was a deliberate provocation. If the Japanese were monitoring Midway communications, and they were, they would report the information up the chain of command. And if they did, that report would appear in intercepted Japanese traffic. 24 hours later, Rochefort's intercept team picked up a Japanese encrypted transmission. It reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. AF was Midway. With that confirmation, Rochefort contacted Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, and Layton did something that had never been attempted in military intelligence with that level of specificity. He sat down with his charts of Pacific wind patterns and ocean currents, his years of study of Japanese naval doctrine and decision-making, and his detailed analysis of Yamamoto's operational history. And he produced a prediction. The Japanese fleet would attack from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees, at a distance of 175 nautical miles from Midway, at approximately 6 a.m. on the morning of June 4, 1942. Nimitz read the report. Washington still wasn't convinced. The admirals in the capital had reviewed the same intercept data and reached a different conclusion: that the intelligence was incomplete, that trusting a code that was only partially broken was a gamble that could cost the United States its last functioning carrier force, and that if Nimitz moved his ships to Midway and the intelligence was wrong, the entire west coast of the United States would be left undefended. Nimitz listened to every argument. Then he bet everything on Rochefort and Layton being right. He ordered the carrier Yorktown into Pearl Harbor for immediate emergency repairs. Naval engineers calculated the work required would take 2 to 3 months. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. They worked without stopping. 3 days later, the Yorktown was operational. Not perfect, not ideal, but capable of combat. Nimitz now had 3 carriers. Yamamoto was coming with 4. In any conventional analysis of forces, that difference was decisive. But Nimitz was not planning a conventional battle. He was planning an ambush. He ordered all 3 carriers to position themselves 300 miles north of Midway, exactly at the point Layton had identified as the location from which they could strike the flank of the Japanese fleet at the moment Yamamoto launched his attack on the island. They called the position Point Luck. It was not luck. It was information. Don't go anywhere. The next 5 minutes of this story are the reason military historians have been writing about Midway for 80 years. Yamamoto was advancing toward Midway with complete confidence. His own intelligence services had reported that the American fleet was in Pearl Harbor. No unusual activity in the Central Pacific had been detected. The element of surprise, his planners assured him, was fully intact. What those planners did not know, what no Japanese intelligence asset anywhere in the Pacific had managed to detect, was that 3 American carriers had been sitting motionless and silent in a section of the ocean that Yamamoto's charts did not account for. Waiting. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from Yamamoto's 4 carriers to attack Midway. The plan was unfolding exactly as designed. The island's defenses were hit hard. American aircraft based on Midway scrambled to intercept and were badly mauled. From where Yamamoto sat aboard the Yamato, the operation appeared to be proceeding on schedule. What happened next was not on anyone's schedule. At 7 a.m., American torpedo bombers from the Carrier Task Force attacked the Japanese fleet. 42 aircraft. Slow, low-flying, obsolete TBD devastators. Unescorted. Flying directly into the most heavily defended naval formation in the Pacific, with no realistic chance of survival against the Zero fighters waiting for them. The Japanese Zeros destroyed them almost completely. 35 of the 42 torpedo bombers did not return. They did not sink a single Japanese carrier. They did not seriously damage a single Japanese ship. From a tactical standpoint, it appeared to be a catastrophe. It was not. Because the torpedo attack, those 42 aircraft flying into certain destruction, had done something that no one had planned and no one could have predicted. The Zeros had descended to sea level to destroy them. Every Japanese fighter defending the carrier fleet was now at low altitude, out of position, unable to rapidly climb back to intercept an attack from above. And the flight decks of the 4 Japanese carriers were now exposed. In that exact interval, in those minutes when Japanese air defense was completely mispositioned, the American dive bombers arrived from altitude. Commander Wade McCluskey had lost contact with the Japanese fleet. He had been searching for critical minutes with fuel dropping toward the point of no return, with the decision to abort becoming unavoidable. Then he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer cutting through the water below. A ship moving at speed, clearly heading somewhere important. He followed it. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers found the Japanese carriers. Their flight decks were loaded with aircraft in the process of being rearmed and refueled for a second strike. Fuel lines were running across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat partially secured beside the aircraft. The carriers were, at that precise moment, as vulnerable as they would ever be. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were on fire. The 4th was destroyed hours later. Yamamoto received the news aboard the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, hundreds of miles from the battle. 4 carriers, gone. 248 aircraft, gone. 3,057 Japanese sailors and aviators, dead. Against 307 Americans killed, 150 American aircraft lost, 1 carrier sunk. The carrier that sank was the Yorktown, the same ship Nimitz had insisted could be repaired in 72 hours, the same ship Washington had said needed months. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, had survived the initial attack. Its commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack, and his aircraft found the Yorktown. They hit it 3 times. Later that day, a Japanese submarine finished it off. Nimitz lost the ship he had staked the battle on, but by then it didn't matter. The 4 carriers that had been the offensive heart of Japanese naval power in the Pacific were gone. Without them, Yamamoto still had the Yamato. He still had battleships. He still had submarines. But without carriers, none of those forces could project power across the Central Pacific. The promise Yamamoto had made 6 months earlier, that Japan would run free for a year, that he would drag what remained of American naval power to the bottom of the Pacific, that the United States would sue for peace before its industry could reverse the outcome. That promise had expired at 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942. When McCluskey found the destroyer's wake, when the Zeros were at sea level, when the Japanese flight decks were full of fuel and unsecured ammunition, Yamamoto ordered a full retreat. Japan would never again hold an offensive position in the Pacific. Yamamoto continued commanding the combined fleet for nearly a year after Midway. He understood better than anyone what the loss meant, not just tactically, but mathematically. The window he had calculated in 1940 had closed. American shipyards were now producing carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American pilot training programs were producing aviators faster than Japan could replace the ones lost at Midway. The industrial engine Yamamoto had watched with dread during his years in the United States was now fully engaged, and there was nothing he or anyone else in the Japanese Navy could do to stop it. He spent those final months executing defensive actions, trying to slow the inevitable, buying time for a negotiated outcome that his own government refused to pursue. In April 1943, American codebreakers, the same intelligence apparatus that had broken JN-25B, intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection itinerary of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Nimitz authorized a long-range interception mission. 16 P-38 fighters flew 400 miles at low altitude to avoid radar detection and intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft exactly on schedule. Yamamoto was killed. The man who had warned Japan it could not win was shot down by an enemy using the same advantage that had destroyed his fleet at Midway: information. For 3 more years, the war would continue taking American lives. But the final outcome, the defeat of Japan, had been decided in 5 minutes over the Central Pacific, at a point in the ocean that Yamamoto never knew existed until it was too late. After the battle, Chester Nimitz said something that military historians have been quoting ever since. He said Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence, not of ships, not of aircraft, not of numbers of men, of information, of the capacity to know what the enemy was going to do before he did it, and the willingness to act on that knowledge when no one else was prepared to believe it. Yamamoto had more carriers, he had more aircraft. He had a plan that any conventional analysis would have declared superior, but he did not know what Nimitz knew. That asymmetry, that gap in information across an ocean where neither man could see the other, was what decided the battle before it began. Joseph Rochefort never received the recognition he deserved. The admirals in Washington who had doubted his analysis made certain he was transferred out of Station Hypo within months of the victory. He was reassigned to a lesser post. No ceremony, no public explanation. The commendation Nimitz had personally recommended for him was blocked. He received it decades later, posthumously. Edwin Layton, the man whose prediction had been accurate to within 5 degrees in 5 minutes, wrote his memoirs years after the war. He titled them, "And I Was There," because he was there when no one else wanted to be, when Washington was still unconvinced, when the numbers didn't add up, when betting everything on incomplete intelligence seemed like the most irresponsible decision an admiral could make. Yamamoto had warned his government that America would destroy Japan. He had put it in writing. They had ignored him and ordered him to execute the attack he had warned against. He executed it, because that was his duty, and then spent the next 6 months trying to fix what he had told them could not be fixed. Midway was not where America won the Pacific War. It was where Japan confirmed what Yamamoto already knew. The question worth sitting with is this: at what point does a military leader's obligation to obey orders end, and his obligation to the men under his command begin? Yamamoto knew the answer. He just wasn't permitted to act on it. If this kind of history interests you, the decisions behind the battles, the men history forgot, the moments that actually decided the war, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe. There's more coming.